Test, test. 1, 2, 3, test, test. 1, 2, 3, test, test. 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Again, thank you all for coming. Tonight, we welcome two very gifted authors from Pennsylvania and McMinnville, Oregon. Their most recent books include Winter Kill and When We Were Birds. Now, without further ado, I will give you Joe Wilkins and Todd Davis.
All right, hello all. Thank you for coming out on a snowy evening. Thanks to David and Jody and Nate and everyone for bringing me here. And a special thanks for Todd for driving with me the whole way here and listening to my music and hanging out. Todd's new book is really why we're here, Native Species. It's beautiful. It's for sale right back there, so get a hold of it. So I thought I'd read a couple of short prose selections and then a couple of poems to get us going here. So these are a couple of short selections from my memoir, The Mountains and the Fathers. I grew up in a little tiny town in eastern Montana, in a country not that much different from this country, a long ways from many places. You couldn't catch a plane for hours. People asked, where are you from? Say that again, where are you from? So I'm going to read a couple of selections from the prose and then move into poetry. So the book, the memoir has these really short selections, quick, really intense memories, and there's a whole line that runs through the book that are all titled A Fragment from My Grandfather's Body. My maternal grandfather lived just down the road from us, and he was a very important person in my life. And many of these, he sort of is threaded through the book, and then the subtitle to this particular one is called A Cheating So-and-So. When I am 9, my father dies, leaving my mother with 300 acres of farmland along the Musselshell River and 3 young children. My grandfather is an old man, but he does what he can for us. Tonight, he is teaching my brother and me to play poker. It is April, lambing season, late in the evening, and we're sitting in the kitchen at the kitchen table, killing time as we wait to make the midnight pass through the sheep shed, checking for ewes in labor. My grandfather deals a game of stud, and his face is suddenly stone. My brother, only 7, squeals with delight at a pair of 3s. So my grandfather bets him up and clears him out with 2 jacks. My mother has long since gone to bed, and my grandfather leans back now, laces his fingers behind his head, and tells us that he nearly shot a man once. It was just after he'd quit school and started cowboying for Frank Schuster out of Broadview, out on the Comanche Flats. One night, a bunch of cowboys and hired men were at the poker table, and this fellow was winning hand after hand. My grandfather says, I saw that cowboy slip an ace from under his arm, and I stood up, drew my gun on him, and called him a cheating so-and-so. He pauses, rubs the gray stubble along his jaw. My Uncle Okie, he continues. He stood up beside me and hit me in the face, knocked me clean out. I woke later that night, Okie telling me not ever to do a damn fool thing like that again. My grandfather's silent for a long while, so we are silent too. And when he rises and pushes in his chair and tells us it's time, we follow him out into the night. He flicks on the lights of the sheep shed, the low glare and shadow of 3 widely spaced bare bulbs, and we walk through the herd. We find a ewe down in the dry straw near the back. She is straining hard. We wait and watch, but the lamb's not coming. My grandfather tells us to keep an eye on her. He walks back across the shed to the wash basin and rolls up his sleeves. I glance over and am shocked by the sudden white splash of skin above his wrists. He washes slowly, deliberately, all the way up to his elbows. He doesn't dry his hands, just walks toward us, the drip of water running from his fingers. We kneel down beside the ewe. My grandfather tells us to hold her, talk to her, he says, so we do. We tell her it'll be all right. We look at him as he reaches in and say it again. It'll be all right. His right hand, then wrist and forearm disappear. His movements are careful, delicate. The ewe lays her head on the straw, closes her eyes to the pain. My grandfather pulls and pulls, and the lamb slips into his hands, hands that nearly took a man's life. And there's blood and afterbirth steaming on the straw, on his arms, everywhere. He He runs a finger through the lamb's mouth and sets it near its mother's warmth. We rise, stiff and suddenly very tired. My grandfather washes up. He turns off the shed lights and walks out into a darkness that is broken only by the faint light of stars. So much of this memoir traces my own searching for a father figure as a young man. My grandfather is the most important one in my life, but there's others, many of them teachers at the local public school. And this is the teacher I had in 5th grade. And the best, this is probably better than the piece I'm about to read, but about 5 years ago, the student worker at the college where I work came down and knocked on my door and said, Professor Wilkins, there's a Mr. Weirdy on the phone for you. I said, oh, God, what? He said, a Mr. Weirdy? And so I went down and answered the office phone, and it was indeed Mr. Weirdy, my 5th grade teacher. And he had Googled his name. He said, I'm applying for a new job, and I Googled oneself as one does these days. He said, your book was the first thing that came up. And then he asked me to write him a recommendation for the job he was applying for. So this is called Bruce Weirdy. If some boys start messing around, he doesn't look the other way or shake his finger. He throws them up against the wall. And not just the bad ones. He'll take the good boys who are being bad only right then and throw them up against the wall too. He'll throw just about any boy up against the wall and hold him there by the armpits, or with bunched fistfuls of winter coat, the boy's sneakered feet swinging just above the blacktop. And Mr. Weirdy, his dark beard wild about his face, his black thick-rimmed glasses framing his wide eyes, that smell of him, of earth and burnt coffee and prairie weeds, of someone who lives half the year in a teepee down on the Musselshell River and doesn't use deodorant and doesn't care. He'll say, tell me what you did and why it was wrong, and then you can go. Folks around town shake their heads, claim that Mr. Weirdy is a hippie, a tree hugger, a radical. But my mother, who doesn't wear makeup herself, who even though our turntable is broken and we don't have the money to fix it, every now and again gets out her old Joan Baez and Gordon Lightfoot records and runs her hands across those worn, dusty covers. My mother tells me that folks around here only call Mr. Weirdy those names because they don't know what else to call him. Don't know anyone like him. I think maybe my mother's right. Sure, Mr. Weirdy writes letter after letter to the president. Sure, he refuses to watch TV. But he cuts and stacks cords of pine wood outside his teepee, and he stays as warm as the rest of us all winter. And you should see him teach. There's no I'm okay, you're okay nonsense. He simply will not abide students putting their heads down on their desks during algebra. He makes us turn in our homework first thing every morning. He has us analyze stories and poems, has us deliver in front of the whole class the speeches of Abraham Lincoln and Chief Joseph and Martin Luther King Jr. This is all news to us. We have only just finished with dioramas and clay models as major educational undertakings. Mr. Weirdy doesn't care. He has a chart and he makes us read real books, lots of them. He has us perform Macbeth for the whole school up on the main stage. When Halloween comes around, he dresses up like a pancreas. He just doesn't care. Mr. Weirdy plans a squid fest, complete with squid dissection, squid feast, and interpretive squid dance. There is a squid trivia competition too, which I win, which makes me the Squid King. I am proud to be the Squid King, and Mr. Weirdy is proud of me, but not too proud. He still makes me work. He pushes me from bright-covered fantasy paperbacks to Tolkien and Le Guin. Hands me a tree grows in Brooklyn and a river runs through it. I read them all. I read, and like Mr. Weirdy, do not apologize for it. In fact, I begin to glory in it. I get as smart and weird as I want, and I don't care what the other kids think. Today, though, I have lost my book. I was reading Steinbeck of Mice and Men. I liked it. I didn't mean to lose it. I don't know what's happened to it. And because my face goes bright and hot at even the thought of doing something wrong, I have been for most of the morning trying to figure out how to tell Mr. Weirdy the truth and still stay out of trouble. Maybe, I decide, it's a matter of presentation. So when we sit down for our one-on-one reading session, I fold my hands in my lap and say clearly, as if there's no other way to put it, my book was lost. No, Mr. Werdy says, and I feel like I might fall out of my chair. I start to sputter. You lost it, he says, cutting me off. It was not just lost, as if you are not responsible, as if it had the power of locomotion. It is a book. It is not animate. It did not get up and go hide itself from you. No, you are responsible. You lost it. Tell me that you lost it. Mr. Werdy has never said anything like this to me before. I mean, I was the Squid King. I blink back, tears mumble, I lost it. Yes, you did, but we'll find you another copy. He rises to leave, but looks down at me again, and don't use the passive voice. It's sloppy. Confuses subject and object, and then we no longer understand action. You know better than that. Don't do it. As Mr. Werdy walks away, I stare, shamed at my shoes, and when at the end of the year the school board sort of encourages Mr. Werdy to leave, and he does, I pretend I'm as happy as all those boys he threw up against the wall. So some of the pieces are these really intense moments of memory, and then some of them try to take a bigger view. And this is one of those. Last piece from the memoir here. It's called Sky. We rode into the world on the backs of pickups. Say sitting atop what's left of a load of Bull Mountain furnace coal. My jeans blackening and greasy, my grandfather turning his Ford down the gravel road to our house, splitting this load of coal like the last one between his stone cellar and our earthen cellar. Maybe coming back from the ranch, my grandparents up front, my brother and me in the bed, with our backs up against the cab, some old wooden posts and a thick ring chain beneath us, the highway wind wheeling dust and straw. Or letting the GMC idle in the snow-swept north pasture, clambering into the back, cutting twine and tossing a good ton or two of alfalfa hay flake by flake to the sheep. Or the backs of our thighs burning against the tailgate as my mother drives us all down to the river for an afternoon splash and mud fight. Or a bunch of boys piling into the bed of my dun orange 69 GMC for a ride down to the Lazy JC for Gatorades and beef jerky before basketball practice. Or Tony and Chip, who seemed even as boys so certain the world would not ruin them, or perhaps they simply welcomed whatever ruin might come. Tony and Chip squirming out the back window of the cab and climbing into the pickup bed at 60 miles an hour, shaking cans of Mountain Dew and tossing them back of us like bombs onto the highway. Or the River Loud night my friend drank too much up at that summer basketball tournament in Reed Point. We were in the junior high division on a team with some boys we'd played against during the last season, and after we lost out, one of their older brothers told us to jump into the back of his sleek little Toyota pickup, and we did, and he drove us then up into the Absaroka Mountains, where there was a fire of pine and cedar spitting hot sap and sparks, a radio turned up loud, cans of Bud Light and a bottle of vodka going around and around. We couldn't have been more than 14. We'd been friends since third grade, though in a few months his mother, scared for her life, would leave in the middle of the night with him and his sisters, and we would lose touch. That night, out of Reed Point, shoulder to shoulder in the pickup bed where I'd made him lie down after he'd pulled on that bottle one too many times, my friend told me he wished his father would just die. That God was asleep at the wheel up there letting a son of a bitch like his father live. That it would be a whole lot easier if someone would just murder the bastard. And for the mountains and tall pines and ragged firelight, I couldn't even see the sky. It's going to read a couple poems. There we are. Wrong thing altogether. Sorry. Here we are. Todd and I were talking about this on the drive up. The ways we as writers get to reach into other spaces and other minds and other lives. And I think beyond that, in fact, we might be called to, tasked to reach into other lives and minds and spaces. And I feel that more and more as I've wrote my own story many times and feel as though I need to reach farther into spaces and things I know, but in some ways also don't know. And so many of the poems in the book that's coming out maybe a year from now or so, it's called Thief, are attempting to do that. And I want to read a couple of those poems and then read one from the last book of poems. And so the new book of poems, Thief, has a couple of series in it, poems that are all titled the same, or all sort of doing the same thing. And one of them, there's a number of them, and they're all titled Lost Boys of the Upper Great Plains. And so I want to read the first one of those. This is Lost Boys of the Upper Great Plains. When the gun boys stumble home, I'm a shadow in the abandoned barn, a scrawny one with a can of Coke and a handle of vodka. Yellow smell of straw, all I remember of my mother. Shit-stained rafters, the terror of underbridges and uncles. Yes, this is the kingdom of lost boys. Those long hair of hip, rib, and heart, delicate as antelope or certain girls. There are so many of us. Our patience, that of meltwater. Our anger, involving pills and wires. Night wind rattles the barn mouth. Stars salt the barn holes. And we are streaks of lean in the alfalfa field when rifle shots pin the night to our backs. In the other series in that book comes from, you can never get away in this day and age, right? It comes from an email I had from a friend who I hadn't talked to in over 20 years, who of course found me through Facebook. That's the way these things go. And it was an incredibly vulnerable email, an incredibly brave email, and I tried to reciprocate as bravely and vulnerably as I could, and then I heard nothing back, and I wanted so to continue the conversation, and so of course that's where these poems ended up going, and this is one of this long series. It's actually towards the end, so it's called This Late Hour, or Poem Against the Crumbling of the Republic. Oh, old friend, I guess let's not talk politics. It wouldn't go well. What did, though? After her brother ate shit on the bridge, I wrote her a letter, slipped pressed leaves into the envelope, wild rose, cottonwood, willow. You got her drunk and fucked her. It was like that, mostly. You see now how it is to be discouraged. That's what it means, you know, to be emailing someone you haven't spoken to in 20 years for advice. What if we had loved each other and said so? Shall we commence even at this late hour, telling the truth? The pines beetle killed, the great cedars nothing but stumps. Old friend, how old is your boy? Mine's 7. If you ever met him, he'd walk right up and put his arms around you. You can be sure. Last one. Speaking of my son, he's a little older now, a little bigger. But at one point he was really small and lovely. And this is a poem that comes from that time. And he's still lovely, but lovely in a very different way. And I would go up and tell a goodnight story to him and his younger sister. And I went up one night and asked him if he wanted a goodnight story. And he said, yes. And I said, well, what kind of story do you want? What kind of story should I tell? And he said, tell me. He was about half asleep. He said, tell me the story about when we were birds. And so I tried to tell that story that night, and then, of course, got right down to the real business the next morning, revising that story into a poem. So it's called My Son Asks for the Story About When We Were Birds. When we were birds, we veered and wheeled. We flapped and looped. It's true, we flew. When we were birds, we dined on tiny silver fish in the watery hearts of flowers. When we were birds, we sistered the dragonfly, brothered the nightwise bat. And sometimes when we were birds, we rose as high as we could go, light, cold, and strange. And when we opened our beaked mouths, sundown poured like wine down our throats. When we were birds, we worshiped trees, rivers, mountains, sage knots, rain, gizzard rocks, grub-shot dung piles. Like all good beasts and wise green things, the mothering sun. We had many gods when we were birds, and each in her own way was good to us. Even winter fog, which found us huddling in salal or silk tassel, singing low, sweet songs and closing our blood-rich eyes and sleeping the troubled sleep of birds. Yes, even when we were birds, we were sometimes troubled and tired, sad for no reason, and so pretended we were not birds and fell like stones, the earth hurtling up to meet us, our trussed bones readying to be shattered, our unusually large hearts pounding for nothing. Yet at the last minute we would flap and lift, and as we flew shudderingly away, we told ourselves that this falling we would remember. We thought we would always be birds. We didn't know. We didn't know we could love one another with such ferocity that we should. Thanks.
Thank you for coming out tonight, and thanks to David for setting these things up. I always feel like I have to give this disclaimer at the start of a reading. I come from very poor, uneducated stock, Appalachian. My mother was born in Virginia, in Lexington, Virginia, in Stonewall Jackson's house. It was the hospital in 1934. I've been where the birthing room was, because it's a museum now. And she grew up during the Depression with her parents and her grandparents farming, subsistence farming in Collierstown. My father was from Kentucky, and his parents, my grandparents, had a 1st and 4th grade education. My mother's parents had 8th grade educations. So I write, and I've always lived in the Rust Belt. I was born and raised in Elkhart, Indiana on the Michigan line. I've lived at times in Appalachia, as well as where Appalachia and the Rust Belt come together, and that's where I live now. And so I write for the people in those places. And so I thought I'd begin with 2 poems about those kinds of folks. I always feel like I'm passing in academic settings, moving back and forth. I feel much more comfortable. Here, I'll tell you, when I'm in the gym lifting in Altoona, guys always come up to me. We talk hunting, fishing, talk about what's going on the railroad. Altoona was a big railroad center. Still, Norfolk Southern has its machine shops there, repairing the engines. And they'll say, yeah, after a while, what do you do? Where do you work? Where I'm from, and they say Yins. This is the area of Yins. Where do you Yins work? And I, like a local, say, up to campus. Yeah, what you do up to campus? You work on grounds crew? Nope. And I love landscaping. Nope. You repair engine stuff up there? Nope. You work in the kitchen up there? Nope. What do you do? I teach. And then their heads turn sideways. Yeah, I teach. I have a PhD. I'm passing. I'm fooling everybody. So, but I write for the people in my background and for the people I've always lived among. And so this is a poem called Burn Barrel. And my family's always had a burn barrel, and sometimes burn barrels are all right, but a lot of times we do a lot of abuse with them. But I want to honor the abuse. So burn barrel. A girl is throwing trash at the flames, anything that will burn. Plastic milk jugs, cardboard boxes, the electric panels of broken toys, and the needled syringes her mother uses to shoot insulin into her thighs. The fire smolders, gray to black to purple, mutating into a green plume like the peacock feather she bought when her class took a trip to the zoo. She slips a caramel between her lips, stolen from her grandmother's pink candy dish. She watches snow fall and the wind blow across the mouth of the barrel, whistling smoke into a field of corn stubble, shading a trail to the edge of the woods where each day it grows dark a little earlier. She hears the snowplow on the county road, sees sparks as the blade strikes asphalt. When her stick stirs what's left of the flames, she feels the sugar in her body rise against the barrel that warms her. She feeds the fire that melts the sky. And I grew up in a glaciated area, lots of lakes in northern Indiana and lower Michigan, and ice fishing is a rite of passage. Perhaps a rite of passage, too, is having your truck fall into the lake and have to get towed out later. You'd think we'd learn from this, but we don't. So this is about guys I grew up with ice fishing. Cracks. A pickup slips over the ice, rear tires spinning, turning a circle, then another, a series of donuts in a mechanical dance that causes the three boys to swear and laugh, spilling beer onto their laps and the seats that already stink of cigarettes and sweat. Their dads and uncles sit in hastily erected shacks, hovels spread across the lake, humped over like dirt at the entrance to gopher dens. They fish in the half-light of heaters, drinking schnapps and whiskey, readying themselves for the rod to bow, hovering over an augured hole as if it were a nest in need of guarding. When at last the line jerks down into the dream of a northern pike, they fumble with the reel, hearts racing ahead of an ending they imagine will be told at the bar on a Saturday in June. Glasses of beer sweating, hands spread wide in a lie to suggest the size of the fish whose head sprang from the slush-filled abyss, only to escape their grip into the black depths of late December. Air snakes through the truck's cab, windows rolled down so these bored boys can scream at the stars salted across the sky. Most of the men have gone to eat supper, to watch the Lions lose one more game on TV. The smell of propane lingers, stirred with the beer the boys burp as they smoke cigars and cough. They've parked the truck at Ralph's shanty, and the older brother spits into a plastic jug, snuff stuffed under his lower lip, as he tells stories about a buck he killed in October and a girl he dated from the next town over with a mouth as soft as velvet. There are always cracks in the ice, but trying to decide which seam is harmless and which leads to the bottom is a matter of luck. They've grown accustomed to the lake's groaning, having heard its teeth chatter since they were children. Sun melting into the horizon, everything refreezing in a slick swatch of darkness. Toward the south end of the lake, springs thin the ice, but the boys believe the cold ensures their passage. On the way back, a wheel breaks through, front end dipping, the entire truck tipping, then plunging forward like a duck, tail feathers pointed at the moon. Every year, some drown, and even more trucks sink. But tonight, with the windows open, each boy places a foot on the seat and leaps to safety, rolling onto their sides, praying the ice shelf will hold. The sound of the truck being sucked beneath the surface is smothered by their happy hollering, none of them thinking about the cost when Samansky's Towing sends a diver down with a cable and hook, or how their moms will cry as their dads berate such stupidity, which of course is inherited. For now, they can only hoot at their own good fortune, cold stars warmer with their escape, sparkling like the fake diamonds they give to girlfriends on 6-month anniversaries, the moon offering just enough light to help them to shore, and to the county road they'll walk all the way back to town. So those are the guys that I grew up with. And a lot of my poems have death in it. I remember writing that poem, and I got to the place in the poem, and I thought, no, they're going to live this time. Some of my friends sadly didn't. So yeah, that's a fun part. You get to resurrect or play God in other ways in your poems. Poem called Almanac of Faithful Negotiations. We're always negotiating our mortality. This begins native species. It has an epigraph by the classical Chinese poet Tu Fu. Here at the edge of heaven, I inhabit my absence. On the first day, we find evidence of elk, but not the elk themselves. On the second, we see the charred and blackened sleeves, fire leaves, but not a single flame. By the third day, the oldest trees have already ascended, but the microbial mouths buried in the dirt remain. After 4 days, our minds flood with rivers and creeks, and we find it hard to speak, except in mud and stone. On the 5th, ravens decorate a white oak snag, croaking in the voices of our drunk uncles, reminding us whose house we live in. 6 days gone, a fisher stands on hind legs, stares across the meadow's expanse, dares us to approach the porcupine corpse, muzzle red with the body's sugar. When the last day comes, only minutes before dawn, susurration of wind, stars moving back into the invisible, all of us wondering when we will join them. Poem of celebration. How many of you like Coltrane? We have some Coltrane lovers? Okay, a few. All right, good. St. John Coltrane. At least he gets sainted in my poem. So it's called Coltrane Eclogue. And it has an epigraph by John Coltrane. He said, "You can play a shoestring if you're sincere." Where the beak, and I should probably say this because it was last night at Western Oregon when I read the poem, somebody came up after and said, "I've always said pileated." Pileated is acceptable, but most of the ornithologists, including many Cornell graduated ornithologists, say pileated. If you go online and do pronunciation guides, I did it just this morning, 4 of the 5 say pileated. I grew up saying pileated. So, how many want me to say pileated? How many want me to say pileated? None. So we're going to go with pileated. Good. I can go back home. Where the beak of a pileated opened a row of holes down the length of a snag, wind blows across each notch, angles of breathing, like St. Coltrane unfastening pearl and brass, exhalation rushing through the neck of a saxophone, bending into the sound that envelops anyone with ears to hear. I've started to chant a love supreme, although I'm alone more than 4 miles into the crease, trying to pick up the rhythm, how each lungful glides through hemlock needles, kestrel slipping out onto the updraft, with one wing beat shifting the air ever so slightly. And yet another woodpecker, drilling the side of a dying tree, a northern flicker that stays just out of sight, laying down a percussive line. I feel foolish for saying this, but it's like being reborn. A syncopation that can call down rain, make the bud of a shad bush unfurl, unwrap the slow, honest tongues of beaver, and stamp a moose's enormous hindquarter like a bass. All the others silenced, fingers of that long-dead saint scaling gut strings before a Blackburnian warbler joins in with its thin, plaintive notes, and a goddamn bluebird which should seem trivial, but is not, breast puffed, raising its head toward a God that surrounds us, who opens our stupid mouths and commands us to play whatever instrument we've got. So I don't know if you've ever thought about what instrument you've got, but I hope you're playing it with joy. Other times, if you need a dirge, right, play the dirge, whatever it must be. I'm going to redefine kissing for you in this poem. So it's called Returning to Earth. It has an epigraph by the Polish poet, and I always butcher his first name, Czesław Miłosz. Trust in the light that shines through earthly forms. Trust in the light that shines through earthly forms. So returning to earth. At the bottom of an abandoned well, dug more than a century ago, the moon rises from the center of the earth, a crust of ice forming around its edges. The stand of larch outside our bedroom window sways, golden needles stirring the air underneath its boughs. I open the window to hear the river sailing away, riding the stone boat of the basin carved by spring floods. Beyond the faint light of a candle, your voice asks if we might touch and remember how our children were made, how the bodies of our parents were returned to earth. I want our children's hands to hold the river, to watch it spill through their fingers back to a source older than our names for God. Beneath a waxing moon, we've witnessed animals dragging their dead into the light. Tonight, we imagine some suckling their young who are born blind in these coldest months. Soon the river will freeze, and come morning, we'll break the ice in the well so we may drink. In dark shelter, I place the words of a prayer upon your tongue. You are gracious, saying the prayer back into my waiting mouth. So next time you kiss somebody, it's a prayer. Say the prayer back into their mouth, and if you're lucky, they'll say the prayer back into your mouth. I miss my wife at the moment, so I'll read you a poem about my wife. A poem when I was in Montana, and we'd been away from each other for a few weeks. She was back teaching already. I was on sabbatical. It's called With Nothing Between Us and the End of the World. And the title comes from a line by Shan Ray, a poet who teaches up at Gonzaga. So with nothing between us and the end of the world. Another hot, dry summer. Cutthroats swim from the main river into the North Fork, waiting for October and November. Gray days with the possibility for rain, then snow. I'm here alone, our sons having drifted into lives of their own. On the phone, you tell me the butternut squash have ripened, the final tomatoes green. A shadow swirls from between rocks as a trout rises to a fly outlined by the sun. Even a few days' separation hurts. The absence of your silhouette when you wake in the night, out of habit walking down the hall to look into the boys' room. Water collides, wears away stone, fashioning a new path. This close to such churning, I wouldn't hear a bear until it was so near there'd be little to do except pray. We're always at the mercy of the world. I cradle the cutthroat I've drawn from the creek, point its head upstream, allowing cold water to flow through its gills. The fish swivels out of my hands, across the current, like you do after we make love. All right, just a few more here. Yeah, gnosis. I like to think about the things that are mystery. I like to think about what comes after us. I like to think about what has come before us. So, gnosis. In a blue river made of snowmelt that forms this valley of aspen and alder, I fish with my sons until summer's light fades in the recesses of a canyon. While hunting alone, I entered a small cave to take shelter from a passing squall and found the bones of a bear cub curled in a circle of trust. Someday when the white fields disappear and only rain falls from the heavens, this river will vanish too. The trout we catch have throats that shine with a bright red mark, suggesting the role blood plays in betrayal. A woman who is long dead told me that when a river passes away, it holds the memory of itself in the silt left behind. When our species is extinct, what animal will carry the memory of our lives? We're the bearer of memory for so many creatures. We're also the reason so many creatures are passing in this sixth wave of extinction. And I love Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, a Potawatomi Indian who has a PhD in botany, is a specialist in mosses, but who's trying to bring together what she calls traditional ecological knowledge, knowledge of the peoples who have lived here for tens of thousands of years with Western knowledge. And so this poem is dedicated to her. And she has the idea of reciprocity. This comes from many tribal peoples. What the earth gives us so we can live demands reciprocity from us. I think we've forgotten that in general as a culture. So Carol Kasich-Yoon had a book a number of years ago that examined the way we name things. And so this is an epigraph from her. It says, "Then find a name for it. Take your pick. It could be a name from science or one of countless folk names, or you can make up your own. This changes everything, yourself included." And the poem Denomination is dedicated Robin Wall Kimmerer. At dinner, I was talking with David about shadbush, serviceberry, sometimes called sarviceberry, juneberry. Canadians always call it Saskatoonberry. And the naming of that, how it plays a role. It was called shadbush in New England because when the shad ran up the river, that's when the blossoms were on. It was called Juneberry because that's when it ripened. It was called serviceberry because before we had front-end loaders and could bury our dead in the winter, the ground was frozen solid. They would stay in the barn frozen, and when the earth started to warm enough to get a shovel in and dig a grave, those blossoms were in the woods, and often they would create funeral wreaths with those blossoms. So naming matters. Denomination. This neglected stream our ancestors named was named by others who came before them. Those who lived in this place for thousands of years, whose mouths formed a language we might have learned if our words hadn't drowned them. Long before our image marked the water's surface, the stream uttered its own name, comprised of sounds that trouble tongues, an alphabet of falling water shaped by rocks and boulders, by dead trees rotted and washed in clean, shallow graves, by refuse collected in spring floods, by the arguments of snow melting, the confrontation of everything converging, disappearing toward a sea. Like us, the raven and deer, the small speckled trout that swim in agreement with the ever-changing current, the heron who fishes alone, and the porcupine shunned by all but its own, each calls this moving thing by a different name, which surely translates as blessing. And I will end with a poem. I'm not a misanthrope, and I hope we're around a long time as a species. I hope we learn to live better in concert with the species that give us life. But you know, in the Christian tradition, in the book of Revelations, there's the idea of the second coming of Christ, the resurrection of those who are dead, flying up in the air to meet him, a new heaven and new earth being created. I'm often speaking back in my poems to the tradition in which I was raised. I have one poem which I won't read you tonight called Midrash, in which I have Midrash is commentary in the rabbinical tradition that writes into spaces in the text that are ambiguous. Well, when I was a little kid and I read in the Gospels that Jesus came upon a fig tree and he was very hungry, right? And he looked to the fig and it had no fruit on it, and he touched it 3 times and the fig tree withered. He killed a tree. Where's my Jesus, my hippie Jesus of the 1970s, right? You turn the other cheek. You don't kill the tree. Who knows when it'll bear fruit? And so in that poem, I re-envision Christ giving a little penance for his impetuous act and dreaming that he eats stones. He goes to the stream and he finds stones the size of fig seeds and he eats them. And in the morning he shats them out and he buries them. And he doesn't tell the disciples, that's why it's not in the Gospels. But from there, fig trees grow and bear fruit. So I'm always writing back to the text. And so, yeah, we had the chant, and I would agree with this chant. Now it's women's turn. I agree with that chant. I also would love, now it's the animals' turn. So the poem's called, And If There Is a Day of Resurrection. I'm a person of faith with lots of doubt. And if there is a day of resurrection, then on that day may the water in the creek shimmer green, a music never heard take shape in a hatch of caddis and coffin flies, the air bluing as the sun's light dries insect wings, and the bear skull on the ridge, the circle of porcupine quills, the mink's eye sockets, and the coyote's hinged jaw still clutched around the rabbit's femur. May all the bones of the living and the dead rise with skeletal praise, this ancient world being remade in their image. Thanks. So would you like to ask us some questions? Comments, questions, throw us out for being heretics? He's not a heretic. He's a very nice man. I'm a heretic.
Todd, what got you started in poetry?
What did get me started in poetry? My father, so my grandparents had a first and fourth grade education. He went to a one-room schoolhouse in Greene County, Kentucky, and that teacher made him memorize poems. He became a veterinarian, and so I grew up, and it's one of the reasons often I'm more comfortable with other species than human species. My earliest memory is at 3 rubbing down pups after they were born. He was made to memorize these poems, and so working at the animal hospital, he would quote poetry. He loved To a Waterfowl. He from zone to zone, he loved to close down with that. A lot of fireside poets that we call them, plenty of Frost. And it was nice because he could have so easily, the background we came from, the money issues, he could have so easily discouraged my desire to write, but he didn't. He loved that I wrote poems, and we would talk, before he died at 81, at least 2 or 3 times a week, and he demanded that I would read him whatever draft I had going. So that's what got it going.
Yeah, I growing up in a rural place, I sort of thought all the poems were written and that no one had to write anymore, and then we were all done with that. I didn't know you could do that. And then I went to college, and I went to college to be an engineer because I had a really good high school math teacher and I thought I liked math. I just liked his class. But ended up in a poetry writing class my super senior year of college because I didn't know what else to do but stick around there. And the teacher walked in the very first day and started reading us Richard Hugo's Degrees of Grey in Phillipsburg. And I didn't know what I was hearing or what was going on exactly, except that I was really interested in it. And it was in that class where I started to understand that things that matter to me could be made into something beautiful, made into something that mattered to others. And coming from a rural place into the academy where much of what I felt like I had to unlearn much of what I'd learned, then suddenly that mattered again. I could honor it. I could bring it forward. And so poetry was a way to do that. Joe Wilkins.
Todd Davis. I'll tell them about Ursus. You tell them what you're working on or what's coming out next. So I'm a huge fan I'm a huge fan of Joe's work, and I loved Joe's work long before I got to meet him.
Yeah.
I don't know if we met through Sean or not, because we got a friend of Sean Prentice out here too, but I've got to read with Joe a few times. But Joe has a new novel coming out that I've been waiting for. I pre-ordered it the minute it was up, and so.
Yeah, I found myself engaging more narrative. Along with Nate, I studied with Kim Barnes at University of Idaho, who changed my life, and her vision of telling your story led me to memoir, and then allowed me also to be able to imagine that I might be able to tell other stories from the place I was. And so the novel's coming out in March. It's called Fall Back Down When I Die. And I think of it very much as a book of trying to explicate, speak to, honor rural spaces, and as well as trying to think about the landscapes we love and how we have different visions for those landscapes and how they might be.
And I don't know if this will be the case, but so I've written 6 books of poems, and I got to the end of Native Species, and I felt like what I'd done up to that point, I'd covered sort of the humanness, and I may come back to that, but right now it's a manuscript called Ursus. I don't name it as Ursus Arctos horribilis. I don't name it as Ursus americanus. It's just Ursus, so a bear. And basically in this present time, up to maybe 20 to 30 years in the future, and it's a bear dealing with cataclysmic climate change, with all kinds of diseases, and including things like chronic wasting disease, but I don't name it as such. It's viral things moving through the landscape. The encroachment of humans and the clash of humans with this bear. There's a little boy who is going to get carried over from Native Species. There's a poem in Native Species called Taxidermy Cathart Aura. Cathart Aura is a vulture. And it's about a boy who suffers from sexual abuse from his uncle. It was a tough poem to write. I escaped sexual abuse twice. And I went to Penn State and had to live through the Sandusky period as well. And then the county I'm from, much of what's going on with Catholicism, many of those charges that are being brought against priests. So that boy came about in Native Species, but his father, the uncle who abuses him, are also characters. And so it's a long poem, and it's a narrative poem, so maybe it's even a novel in verse. We'll see. Anybody else?
You just keep writing. Or work on something else. Yeah, you just keep things going. You turn to something else, you go read. I often go read someone else's work to see how they're figuring things out. I think especially with poems, I mean, they're shorter. I love that about them, right? You can be working on a poem in about 30 minutes, which is so much nicer than a novel where you feel like you need so much more time. And so with a poem, you're working on one, you're like, that's not working. You turn to the other one, you turn to the next one. And you spend a little time with that, and then you come back, and you're sharper, you're more engaged. And you do that same thing day after day, right? So you do that, and then you go do whatever else you have to do for your daily life, or you go take a walk, or you come back in the evening, and you printed it out, and you take a look at it, and you're like, oh, well, that's ridiculous. That's not a good line. I need to change that. And it becomes clearer as you work on it. But you keep at it. But you keep at it not just staring at it, but you keep at it in a way that you're bringing other things to bear on it, right? Whether it's other poems, other readings you're doing, taking walks, whatever else.
Yeah. Tell them about what Bob said to you, your anecdote about Bob Rickman. Because I love that.
I was telling Todd on the way up here about bringing a poem to my graduate mentor, and it was one of the first times I brought a poem to him, and as many of my poems are, especially then, it was autobiographical in many ways, and he was asking questions about it, asking me to explain these things, and then we just kind of got to talking, and all of a sudden he just stopped and he said, "How do people do it?" And I said, "What?" And he said, "Just make it through a day without writing." And I think in many ways that does matter to me. I have to be writing to make it through the day, to make it make sense for me, to help me understand what's going on as best I can.
So I wanted him to tell you that anecdote because there's nothing wrong. There are many ways to write, and there's nothing wrong with being an occasional writer. But I often tell students, if you can do anything else, do something else besides be a writer. But if you can't, you'll know it, and you'll have Bob's attitude. It's like you look around, like, what's this strange species out here? How do they make it through a day without writing? And that's the case definitely for me. And so I can tell you a very practical thing that happens for me if I'm stuck on something. I often turn to visual art, painting, photography, and the way I'm wired up, I immediately, images start being overlapped onto what I'm working on. A narrative that's not even really in the painting or photograph immediately emerges for me, and it starts to, again, alchemically associate with what I'm working on. So, I think every writer probably has certain tricks. You talked about reading. Definitely, when I get stuck, I often turn to other people's writing. And again, it's not that I copy it or anything. It's more of a conversation. Just like if you were talking to somebody and like that conversation with David about that species. Oh yeah, Saskatoonberry. And then suddenly it makes me think of another species, and I talk back in that conversation. That's what happens when I read other people's work, and that's how it helps me keep moving forward. Yeah. I'll cheat because I can't pick just one. It's always moving water and bears.
I have young children, 9 and 7, and if you ever read The Onion, that satire news strip, there's a great one that says, astronomers found the center of the universe. Says it's his 7-year-old son. And if I'm stuck, I always go to my kids because they're full of energy and life and interesting things to say. So at least right now, that's my favorite thing.
Yeah. They grow up and abandon you. Mine are 20 and 23. I still write about them, but yeah, it used to be the same, man. Totally. When they were that little, man, yes. Other questions? Hey, good.
Yes,
Thank you.